In this video, Chris is going to walk you through pivot tables in Excel. He's going to start with a basic introduction of what a pivot table is, and he's then going to show you how you can create a pivot table and customize it to suit your own needs, and also how to do graphs from your pivot tables. In this section, we're going to once again be using the master list data that we used in the previous video, so you can continue from that, or if you skipped the first video, you can download the data from the link in the description below.
In this session, we're going to show you how to do a pivot table in Excel. And as a way of introduction, I just want to say this about pivot tables. Pivot as a verb means to rotate or to revolve. If you think of your data as a physical object, a pivot table lets you rotate the data summary and look at it from different angles or perspectives. So why do you want to use a pivot table? Want to use a pivot table to summarize the data contained in a lengthy list. Want to use a pivot table to find relationships within the data that are otherwise hard to see because of the size of the data or the amount of detail. You want to use a pivot table to organize the data into a format that's easy to chart. And if you want to work along, the data we're going to use is exactly the same that we used earlier in the shortcut session, is the master list of schools. I'm going to open the master list of schools again and then talk a little bit about the format of the data. That's important. I'm going to use exactly the original format that you downloaded from the DBE website. This is the exact same data set. Let me talk a little bit about the format. When you want to use a pivot table, the data must be in a tabular format. What does that mean? It means that you need to have, as your first row, you need to have the headings of the columns. So you need to have column headings. So you, as a start, tabular means you need to have columns and rows. Second important point about the format of the data, apart from the tabular format, you should have no empty rows or empty columns. That's important when you work with a pivot table. There cannot be empty rows in between the data or empty columns in between the data itself. As a third point, you cannot work with subtotals or with totals when you work with the tabular data. Let me show you an example. If I scroll right to the end of this data, you can't have at the end of the learner, when I have the learner column for each school, you cannot have right at the end here, you can't have a total for learners and a total for teachers. Or you can't have subtotals in between, just the subtotal for the total of learners per district or the total of learners per circuit. You can't have that when you work with a pivot table. So let's start. I want to show you how to create a pivot table, showing you quite a few steps. So step number one, when you start with a pivot table, you start with the data. You start right here. I want to work with all the data. So I can do it in two ways. I can start with the data by using Control A. It selects the entire data set for me. But there in Excel, you don't have to have the Control A every time when you work with the data or you create a new pivot table. You can change this data into a table, because then Excel, once it is formatted as a table, Excel would know that you every time would work with the entire data in that table. So it is a good practice to change this data set into a table format. So, and to do that is Control A. So I want to change this entire data, which I now have selected, into a table. Go to my home, and there is a place in my home tab where it says Format as Table. I like to keep it simple, so I use the first format, which is this one. And Excel would give you the range from where, from my home position till the end of this data set. It gives you almost the address of the entire data set. And I say, okay, make sure that your table, this table is it. got headers, so you make sure that that is ticked, and I say OK. Once I've done that, you can now see that my filter, I have a filter within for each one of these headers. There's a filter, and I know now this data is formatted as a table. If I click inside this, you can see here on the left, there's the table name. Like with a spreadsheet, Excel has got a default naming convention. And in this case, it's table 1. The next table in this workbook would be table 2. But I like to give it a meaningful name. So in this case, we know that this is the master list of schools. So I'm just simply going to call this master list. And hit my enter. And now you can see that would be my reference for this table. Where I see master list, it would reference this table. And now once I've done the format of the data, I can now start with my pivot table. So here is step 1. To insert a pivot table, I go to my insert ribbon. I go to the insert tab, click on the insert tab, and then here right on the left, there you see the icon that says pivot table. I simply click on that. Once I click on that, I get this dialog box. And you can see how useful is this when I format the data into a table. Excel would recognize the range that I want. And the moment I have this dialog box, you can see it is around this entire data set. I'm in this mode where I have now selected all the data. And that's what this first, the table range tells you. So that's the first part of this dialog box. The second part is I can decide where I want to place this pivot table. And the default in Excel is always a new sheet. You can also place it on the existing sheet, but it's not recommended because of there is no real space in here. So I would leave this default selection in Excel, the new sheet, and then simply say OK. So here is the important part in creating a pivot table. On the right, I have the area that I use to build my pivot table. It says the pivot table fields with the areas that I need to populate, that I need to use to build my pivot table. And the area on the left is where I will show my pivot table, where I use this area to build, and on the left where I use to display or to show my pivot table. That's what these areas are. So if I click inside this area on the left, then this is what I use to build that. If I click outside this area, you can see my area on the right disappear. I need to be inside this area here so that this can become part of that where I build. This is where I built the table. This is where I display the table. It's part of that. So I show, and if for whatever reason I sometimes want to get rid of this area because I also want to display something here, I can get rid of this area even if I click inside this. So if I click inside here and I say right click, and here where it says hide or show list, I say hide list, you can see even if I click inside this area, this field list does not appear or does not show. And to get it back, I need to click inside there, right click and say show field list. Now it works again. Inside, it shows, outside, it doesn't show. I can change the structure here on the right. So if you go to this, choose fields to add a report, and so in this area right here with this arrow, if I click the arrow here, I can say no, I like my area on the right to have the fields and the areas displayed side by side, and you can see there how it changes. Sometimes it's a little bit bigger especially when I built the pivot table, but I prefer to have my one as a stacked one. My field list and then my area stacked below the field list. So that's how I prefer that, but that's a preference you can decide on. That's the different areas. Now I'm going to show you how to build a pivot table. We're going to use the field list to populate one of these areas, one or more of these areas. And just as a note, the field list is exactly the same as the column headings in the data. That's where all these field names is the list in the pivot table field list. And I'm going to use these fields to populate the pivot table, which we're going to display on the left in this area. But before we do that, we first need to know what we want to do. A pivot table is a very good tool to summarize data, to write a query to summarize the data. And in this simple exercise, I simply want to know the number of schools by province. I want to use the province variable and put it in the rows area. And to do that, there are two ways to do that. I can simply click on the province field, keep it down and drag it, and then drop it in the rows area. That's one way of doing it, and that's the way that I prefer to do that I can actually determine where I want to put the variable, in which area I want to use it. But there's another way to do that, and to get rid of it again, I can simply click on it in this area and then put it outside. So then that's the way to delete it from the area. But there's another way to do that. If I click on the province, in this case the province variable, and I right click, I can then determine where, in which of the areas I want to put that specific variable. So in this case, if I want to put the province variable in the rows, I simply click on add to rows, and you can see it's exactly the same principle. But like I said, I prefer to drag and drop it in that area and see what happens. The moment I drag it and I drop it in the rows area on the left, it is then displayed and start showing the pivot table. And in this case, you can see the province is then in this table, the rows. So the number of schools by province means that these form the rows in the table. And all that I now need is how many schools, and the number of schools comes from this data. Each row is a school. So Excel would then summarize this for me in what the rows are, in this case provinces. So, and I'm going to use I can use the official school name to do the counting in the values area, but I want to use the NatEMIS number because every school should have a code, and in this case it's the NatEMIS number. And I use the NatEMIS number for a specific reason. So let me drag and drop it, and you can see here it is a funny value that comes up here because I need to fix this. I need to change this calculation right here because instead of summing, the Excel sees it as a number. That's why it used the default as a sum, which is wrong in this case. It should be I want to count each school, so I need to change this as a sum, and I can do it two ways. I can change this formula in two ways. I can change it right here. I like to do the change right here, or I can do it in the table. So let me first show you how to change it right here. If I click on it, you can see this arrow next to this sum of the variable. I click on it, and then I get this dialog, this menu option which says value field settings. I click on that, and then I get this dialog box, which gives me the option to select what I want to do. That's the one way. The other way is that I can go straight to the pivot table, again right click, and then say summarize by, and you can see I have the same list. But I prefer to do it right here because here I can see it's wrong. It should be count of NatEMIS. I click on that, value field settings, and then I get this list and I say count. Say okay, and now you can see this list. What does this display? What does this tell us? It shows the number of schools by each province in Eastern Cape, and these are real numbers. These are, we can see in this data set we have 24,981 schools. That's what's in this list. So let's change this table. Let's format this pivot table a little bit. The row labels you can see the row labels is actually the province. So I can change that. I can go straight to this table and say, instead of having Excel's default row labels, I can actually write, simply click on row labels and then start writing province. That is the proper heading of that column in this table. Then the count of net emas, Excel just tells you what happened here was use the net emas and count that. But we know that this count of net emas is actually the total schools. So I can simply write and say total schools. That's the first part that I want to change. I also want to format this a little bit better. So if I'm inside this pivot table, I can use the design. And in my design, I have various options that I can use. So again, I'm going to use this one as an example. What I want to do is I want to add a graph to this pivot table. You need to be inside the pivot table because we want to add a graph to this pivot table. Go to my insert button in the main ribbon that I showed you this in the previous video, the Excel interface, the insert. Once I click on insert, I get this cluster of different graphs. And the one that for now, it's a simple graph. The one that I want to use is a simple column graph or a bar chart. And I click on that and I take the first one. And this graph is dynamic. It is linked to this table. But let me first clean this up. You don't really need a total. The same with the Excel's default is just the total. But we know that this is the number of schools by province. So I can change this heading or this title of this graph. And to do that, I click on this title. And then inside the title, I start writing number of schools by province. This is what this graph displays. You can see the rows in the pivot table becomes the x-axis in this graph. In all pivot tables, if you draw a graph to a pivot table, it will always give you these buttons. And I can hide these buttons. So I put my cursor over this first button, I right click, and then I get these menu options. And the one that says hide all field buttons on chart is the one that I use. I click on that and you can see now I have, although it's still linked to the pivot table, it doesn't show those buttons on the graph. I can ask the pivot table to sort this from the highest to the lowest, from the largest to the smallest. So I can go into this pivot table and you need to be in this column with in the total column. If I right click and then I say sort, and I can say from largest to smallest. See what happens now. I click that. Now you can see how Excel would arrange this from highest to lowest. If I put this in a report, I not always necessarily would have this pivot table with me or the numbers displayed in a table. So I can put a label on each one of these series or each one of these bars. So, and to do that, I click on any bar, I right click, and where it says add labels in this menu option, I simply click on add labels and see what happens. It now shows or displays all the values that's in the pivot table also on the chart or on the graph. I can change any of these using a format. So if I want to change the colors of these columns, I click on any one, right click, and in Excel, always the last option is the format option of that specific object in the graph. So in this case, it is I want to format the data series. So I click on that. And then again, on the right, I get this screen. And this is a very important screen when I work with graphs. It gives you the option to format the graph the way you want to see it. So in this case, I want to change the colors. And in this, you can see this is almost like a paint bucket on the left. If I click on that and I go to fill, I get the option to change the color. And in this case, let's take green. And you can see there I can change the color of the of each one of these series or these bars. I can change my title. If I want to change the title, I click on the title and I want to change that should be in bold. I simply click on that. I want to reduce the space within each one of these columns. So I click on the chart here on any one of these series, right click, format series, and you can see I get here the gap width I can change. And I like as a default mine to be 50. So simply go and write 50 and hit enter, and you can see how it changes the series within the graph. If I go to my data itself, you can see there's a filter that says sector. And in that, I can determine whether a school is independent or public. And I can use that in my pivot table, what we call as a filter. So I can determine these are all the schools. But if I just want to see the public schools in each province, I can use the sector as a filter. And to do that, I go again to my field list. In this case, I want to use this sector, and I again drag and drop, take the sector, populate and drop it within the filter area. The moment I do that, on top of the pivot table appears another area which will then serve as a filter. But if I click the arrow next to the all, you can see it gives me the drop down, and then I want to select only public and say okay, and now you see these are only the public schools within each province. So it's quite useful. I can filter this by any of these variables that really make sense. But in this case, I filtered that as part of the public schools. Two things that I still want to show you on this pivot table. You can see once I start right in the beginning, when I started to create and to draw the pivot table, Excel automatically opens up a new sheet. And then again, it is sheet 1. It gives a default sheet 1. And because I work with the schools by province, I give it a proper name. So I right click on it, rename, and in this case, it's the number of schools. In this case, it's just schools. And I use an underscore province. So I know that in this pivot table, I have created a pivot table, a number of schools by province. It just makes sense when you come back 10 years from now, you know exactly what's within that worksheet. And then the last thing I want to show you here, every time you make a change in an Excel workbook, you need to save it. So, and I simply have here is my quick access toolbar. And in this, I have a save option. And I simply click the save option, and you can see it is now saved. This is my introduction on how to create a pivot table, and I hope it's helpful and useful for you. Thank you very much.